Not at all. Our next speaker is Dr. Tabor Allison, who is an ecologist and director of research for the American Marine Wildlife Institute. That's a nonprofit organization that promotes marine wildlife research. Tabor has published on the trade-offs of wind energy and climate change to wildlife, and he'll be moderating the panel after presentations this morning on that topic. Right now, he's going to talk about wind energy and eagles and tools for mitigating impacts.
Is it the middle button here that I push? I forgot. The arrow. Okay, thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and appreciate the invitation to come here and speak. I'm from Vermont. And I enjoy coming to Wyoming, and was interested that, it was mentioned yesterday that Wyoming is 50th in population in the U.S., and Vermont is 49th, about the 10th of the size. But a lot of the discussion about renewable energy development that I was hearing yesterday also resonates in Vermont as well. It's some of the same kinds of concerns. So what I'm going to do is just provide a very brief overview of what we know about the impacts of wind energy on eagles, and I'm talking about both bald and gold eagles here, and I'm going to be going back and forth nationally, and then talking a little bit about Wyoming, and then talking a bit about how the approaches we're taking to mitigate these impacts. And I'm going to actually start by talking about what I would call presentation highlights. These are some take-home messages, just to give those right from the outset, kind of the points I'm going to be making, that are important in framing the discussion about wind energy and eagles. Eagles are protected from take, and there is a legal definition that many of you are probably familiar with for take, which can either be, in this case, collisions or disturbance effects. But there are permits available that companies, wind companies, as well as anybody who is incidentally taking eagles in the course of conducting otherwise lawful activity, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But bald and gold eagles do collide with wind turbines, and we'll provide some estimates. The frequency of collisions at most projects, and when I'm talking about most projects, there are over 1,000 wind facilities in the country, and most of those projects don't take eagles. And at the projects that do take eagles, the take is typically very low, and there are some exceptions to that, as we'll discuss. There are also many options available to mitigate those effects or mitigate take. And in this context, I'm defining mitigation as avoiding, minimizing, or compensating for the impacts. But I want to emphasize that essentially all of these options are untested. We don't know how effective they are, even as many of them make logical sense. We're using them, we're trying them, but we don't know how well they work in terms of reducing take. And that interacts with the third bullet, as we'll discuss some, because when take is low, when you have a low sample size, it's very difficult experimentally to evaluate a treatment effect. But we are making progress, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. So when we talk about eagles and wind energy, or at least when I think about it, the regulatory drivers are very important, particularly at the federal level, in framing how I think about wind energy and how to address the potential impacts of wind energy on eagles. Bald and golden eagles, along with approximately 1,000 other resident species and bird species in the U.S., are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And bald and golden eagles are also protected specifically under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, which we sometimes refer to as BEGEPA for shorthand, and we'll talk a bit about that. The Fish and Wildlife Service is charged with enforcing BEGEPA and recently revised a rule for how wind companies specifically, but also any other entity who, as I mentioned, interested or having unavoidable incidental take can get a permit. And specifically for wind energy development, the service issued voluntary guidance for how a company could obtain permits for incidental take. And again, incidental take I define, and the service defines as take that occurs during an otherwise lawful activity. So operating a wind farm is a lawful activity, but occasionally birds, eagles are killed, bats are killed, and we would refer to that as take that is incidental, as opposed to purposeful take, which would be shooting or some otherwise harmful activity. So the permitting approach of the service involves first predicting take, and then based on that prediction, you implement what they now refer to as best management practices at the facility. We'll talk some about that to minimize that take. And then any remaining take would potentially have to be compensated for or offset. And so in the course of obtaining a permit, a wind company might go out and predict take at a potential or possible facility that they're proposing and come up with a number of eagles per year that they would take at that facility, the prediction, and then propose BMPs that in theory would minimize that take to the extent practicable. And so in theory, that the amount with the implementation of those BMPs, the remaining or predicted take would go down, and then whatever take can't be avoided or minimized would have to be offset. And I'll come back to that in just a minute when we talk about the status. But when we look at bald and golden eagles, these two maps that you see here are produced from the American AWWI Landscape Assessment Tool. And what these are predictions of where you would find these two species across the landscape of the lower 48. And you can see that by and large they overlap quite a bit, but the pattern of the distribution is substantially different for both species. In this case, the key here, green is year-round, orange is summer only, and blue is winter distribution. And again, these are predictions based on available data. If we focus in on Wyoming, we look at specifically golden eagle use intensity. We heard some discussion about eagles yesterday. Like sage grouse, Wyoming is golden eagle central. It's a heavily utilized area, particularly in the areas that you see in dark orange. Some of the heaviest eagle use, golden eagle use in particular, is in Wyoming, and we'll see some of the consequences of that. And at the same time, what I'm also understanding, at least anecdotally, is that bald eagle activity is increasing in Wyoming as well. One of the ways that the service determines the permitting process, how many permits to issue, what the take levels are based on the population status of these two species. And so if you look in the green font, the total for the two species, about 140,000 bald eagles in the lower 48 in Alaska. That's the most recent estimate from the service, which was 2009, quite a long time ago. There are regular aerial surveys of gold eagle use that are conducted by West in partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service that are giving us reasonably accurate estimates of golden eagle numbers of about 40,000. The most important element of this is the trend. In the case of bald eagles, the population has been increasing and is continuing to increase substantially, particularly since the outlawing of DDT, whereas the golden eagle population is at best stable or possibly slightly declining. The implications of the permitting status of these two species is that for bald eagles, the service actually has a take threshold. They will issue permits. It's done regionally, varies the take thresholds geographically, but the service will issue permits for incidental take of bald eagles that don't require compensation. On the other hand, for golden eagles, the take threshold set by the service is 0. Essentially what the service is saying is that golden eagles can't sustain any additional mortality, and therefore, if they issue a permit, that permitted level has to be offset at a rate of 1.2 to 1, according to the most recent rule. So if we look at some numbers now about eagle fatalities, this is from a publication put together by Fish and Wildlife Service employees back in 2013. And you can see for bald eagles at the time of this publication, there were only 6 known fatalities. The golden eagle fatalities that you see there, those reported, I think that adds up to about 75. You can see there's some geographic variation. If you look at Wyoming, you can see that bald eagles have been killed at wind facilities in Wyoming, and golden eagles have also been killed at fairly high numbers compared to other states. The numbers for golden eagle or bald eagles have gone up. They're now at about 18. Still substantially lower than what we know about fatalities for golden eagles. So most of the focus of looking at effects of wind energy on eagles has been on golden eagles because of the substantially higher numbers of fatalities of golden eagles relative to bald eagles. Another source of information comes from eagle conservation plans produced by companies seeking permits. And what you see here are predicted fatality levels or permitted fatality levels at wind facilities. And as I mentioned before, the numbers are actually fairly low. All to east, the permitted number is 0.6 to 1 golden eagle per year. These are all golden eagle numbers. And some of the other numbers are based on 5-year permits. So Ocotillo is 2 to 3 eagles per 5 years. Chokecherry Sierra Madre, you can see the permitted number is 10 to 14 eagles per year. And that's a fairly large facility at 500 turbines. So again, probably reflecting the number of golden eagles, the activity of golden eagles in the state, we have a higher risk of fatalities at wind facilities. If we look overall, a cumulative estimate, this is a number that is yet to be published. This is not a range, but it's just 2 different estimates based on how the numbers were adjusted for bias. But you can see these were produced by West, 116 or 249. This is the total number of eagles, golden eagles, estimated to be killed at wind facilities annually in the U.S. How does that number compare with other sources of golden eagle mortality? The service is getting much better unbiased estimates of sources of mortality for golden eagles. Poisoning is the leading source of death, followed by shooting. And then you can see collisions, which includes utility wires, vehicles, and as well as wind turbines lumped together. That number has, those numbers are changing all the time. But you can put that national estimate in the context of other anthropogenic sources. For mitigating take, the service uses a take prediction model to estimate fatalities that's based on activity, a collision probability that they estimate, and then the amount of hazardous areas, so how many turbines and the size of the collision area, the rotor swept area. And many people look at that and they say, well, it's fairly conservative and not terribly nuanced in terms of being able to actually predict take. And I worked with some raptor biologists at the Peregrine Fund up in Idaho, and you can see that there's a much more complicated set of hypotheses about what might influence eagle collision risk at a wind facility. And you can imagine the challenge of actually trying to evaluate this experimentally, where when at many facilities you only have maybe one eagle fatality predicted a year. So how do you actually evaluate, when fatality levels are that low, the effectiveness of evaluating these different attributes in reducing or predicting risk? So much more of the attention is focused on BMPs for minimizing collisions. Amanda referenced some of these. All of these, particularly the established practices, every eagle conservation plan and permit proposed or issued include these established practices. They all are very logical. They make a great deal of sense because we think they will affect the activity of eagles at the wind facility. But we don't know actually how effective they are in reducing take. Remember, we have a prediction at the very beginning, and then practices like these are intended to minimize that predicted take to a lower level, but we don't know actually what the effect is on the predicted level of take. And at the moment, the service doesn't give any credit for any of these practices because we don't know whether they work. We talked about curtailment, informed curtailment using either biomonitors or technology, or blanket curtailment in the Altamont, which is one of the areas where eagle fatalities are very high. They've tried seasonal curtailment, which seems to be effective at periods of highest activity. Informed curtailment is a situation where you have an observer, for example, in a tower, sees an eagle, decides the eagle's at risk, and will shut down a turbine or a string of turbines. But again, we have not been able to evaluate the effectiveness of that. How many eagles are saved by informed curtailment? We don't know. But we are working to understand that. There are also detection and deterrent technologies that are under development to detect eagles and then emit an audible sound that would either alert the eagle or dissuade the eagle away from the collision risk zone and hopefully save eagles. Again, these are, their effectiveness with respect to eagles is unknown, but we are in the process of evaluating these at 2 wind facilities in Wyoming and under funding from the Department of Energy, and hopefully in 2 to 3 years we'll have some information that we can share. So the remaining step, compensatory mitigation for golden eagles in particular, the service is interpreting their mandate to enforce the GIPA of no net loss for golden eagles. So if they're issuing a permit for 1 eagle per year, you have to replace that eagle. Right now, the principal means for offsetting that take is power pole retrofitting, in order to reduce electrocutions of eagles at wind facilities. So if a company is obtained a permit, it is agreeing to retrofit a certain number of power poles and avoid electrocution. There are a number of issues associated with power pole retrofitting that we don't have time to go into, but there is a lot of interest in developing additional options. If you remember other sources of anthropogenic mortality for eagles, one way that it protected species. This can be a challenge when the Fish and Wildlife Service is asking a company at a facility to do all they can to minimize take at that facility, that when you do an experiment, of course the classic is to set up a control, which by definition, you're not doing all you can to minimize take. So we have to figure these things out, and I think we're making progress. So thank you, and I'll take questions if I have time.
Yeah, thanks. That was very interesting. I think the most comprehensive discussion of this that I've heard. I'm curious about two things. One is how many take permits have actually been issued so far? Take permits, not EIS notices and things like that.
I am aware of 3.
Okay.
One of those is chokecherry.
Right. And so that permit is actually out. I'd seen the announcement of the EIS process going on. And then what is how is all of this monitored? Is there a legal requirement that wind farms make access to their areas available to officials to check for mortalities and things like that? How does that all get monitored?
Well, the company, so a 5-year permit is issued. And so a company at a facility may have a permit to take 1 eagle a year. And it has to, every year, demonstrate compliance with that permit. It's over a 5-year period, so you're talking about 5 eagles over that 5-year period. So there is a requirement, a compliance requirement that the company has to report. And so they'll do surveys to determine whether or not they've taken an eagle.
And if they don't have a permit, how is the statute enforced?
Well, that's a good question. Two companies in Wyoming, you probably saw in the news, were had plea agreements with the Department of Justice to for take of eagles and other migratory birds. Paradoxically, the plea agreement was under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, not the GIPA. They have certain requirements, fines and research that they need to do in order, as well as applying for a permit, in order to do what they can to minimize take at that facility. What's actually happening now at other, which I think is a more productive approach myself, is what are referred to as settlement agreements. They're civil settlements rather than criminal settlements. And so what the service is doing is directly negotiating with a company and to basically determine how do we deal with past take at this wind facility that occurred without a permit. And that oftentimes involves a monetary payment, which the company can use to fund research. And I think, a lot of people, companies, in my understanding, in the service prefer this approach because it remains with the service rather than a plea agreement, which is really a court-ordered settlement.
We'll do one more question right here.
Thanks, Tabor. In your list of sources of mortality for eagles, poisoning and shooting, I think, are the top 2.
Yeah.
Yet your list of mitigation options seem to be addressing the lower tier. Do you know of any initiatives or ideas for addressing those 2 top sources of mortality in terms of mitigation?
I don't. I think, a lot of the poisoning, my understanding it's incidental, associated with prairie dog control, rodent control, for example. But I don't know. Through our program for developing these models, the first thing we did was survey a group of experts and basically ask them, what do you think are important factors limiting eagle populations, and what do you think their accessibility to mitigation or response to mitigation. And shooting and poisoning did not rank very high, not because they're not important, but because of the challenges in trying to develop an approach that for mitigation that would satisfy the service requirements of quantifiability and verifiability. Because the way the service has set up the rule, again, if you take an eagle, a golden eagle, you've got to replace it. So you have to demonstrate that that eagle has been replaced. And it's a very different kind of standard, my understanding, and you know probably better than I, than for the ESA. That's my understanding anyway. And so that creates challenges for offsetting take, because for roadkill removal, it seems fairly straightforward, but if you have to demonstrate that you've removed enough carcasses to save an eagle, that can be challenging. And so that's why we chose to focus where we did, because it also seemed amenable, the kind of mitigation. Thank you.